I was just trying to get my usual coffee that morning when everything changed. It was around 9:13 a.m. on a Tuesday, just the kind of dull morning where nothing ever happens. I was sitting by the cafe window, nursing a cheap black coffee, when a sleek black Bentley rolled up in front of the curb like it owned the street. It was spotless, shimmering, and expensive enough to turn heads. You could smell the power coming off it. Then he stepped out. Raymond Vale. Anyone who lived in the city knew that name. Chief Executive Officer of Vale Industries. One of the richest men in the region. Fortune 500's Visionary of the Year just a few months ago. Everything about him screamed untouchable. Perfect suit, perfect hair, perfect sneer. People didn't approach him. They watched him. But someone did approach him that day. A man I'd seen before, maybe dozens of times. Most people didn't really see him, though. They stepped around him like he was debris on the sidewalk. His name was Eli. Frail, scruffy beard, skin weathered from nights on cold concrete. He never begged aggressively, never said much. Just held out a trembling hand and hoped for a glance. I think he just wanted to say, "Thank you." Or maybe he was just curious about the car. His fingers gently grazed the side mirror. Barely a touch. Maybe he didn't even realize he'd done it. That was all it took. In one swift, shocking move, Raymond turned and slapped him hard across the face. The sound cracked through the street like a whip. Eli dropped to the ground. Not dramatically, just collapsed. Like something in him had finally given up. He didn't yell, didn't even look up. Everyone froze. No one knew what to say. I felt it in my chest, like I'd swallowed a rock. A teenage boy across the street had his phone up. I didn't notice until I saw the glow of the screen, the camera already rolling. He stood still, recording, eyes wide. He wasn't the only one. People started murmuring. A few others pulled out their phones. Raymond didn't care. He didn't even glance back at Eli. Just straightened his jacket, looked at the smudge on his car, muttered something I couldn't hear, and walked into the cafe like nothing had happened. Like the world hadn't just witnessed a man being knocked down like garbage in the street. I remember looking at Eli. He was still on the ground, his face red where the handprint bloomed. He was blinking slowly, trying to get up, not with anger, just with quiet shame. That image stuck with me. Not the slap, not the billionaire, but the way Eli looked up at nobody, as if he didn't expect anyone to help, as if he'd already made peace with being invisible. The boy with the phone uploaded the video, right there on the sidewalk. No filters, no edits, no captions, just raw truth. By the time I finished my coffee, it had already been shared 100 times. By lunch, it was everywhere. And that slap? It would echo far louder than Raymond Vale ever imagined. It started with a few hundred views, then thousands, then millions. By the time the sun set that same day, the video of Raymond Vale striking a homeless man had been shared so many times that it was impossible to scroll through any social feed without seeing it. No caption necessary. Just a shaky clip of a billionaire slapping a man half his weight for touching his car. And the heartbreaking moment that followed. Justice for Eli was born that night. The outrage was immediate, not performative, not fleeting, real. Celebrities started reposting it, adding words like unforgivable and inhuman. Influencers who once attended Raymond's galas and launched their startups through his funding were now distancing themselves. Some even deleted old photos with him. Human rights activists began calling for legal action, for accountability, for a reckoning. Raymond Vale's team tried damage control. They issued a vague, soulless statement. Mr. Vale regrets that the incident has been misinterpreted and looks forward to clarifying things in the proper venue. Wrong move. Comment sections exploded with fury. Misinterpreted? The man's on the floor. Clarify what? That your car's feelings were hurt? You should have slapped your own ego instead. By the next morning, Vail Industries' stock had dropped 17%. Sponsors began pulling out from partnerships. Lawyers, consultants, and publicists were all burning through hours to craft a new narrative. But no one was buying it anymore. Not after that video. Not when you could pause it and see the look on Eli's face just before he hit the ground. The world wanted to know more. Who was the man who got slapped? And ironically, Eli didn't even know he had become a symbol. While his name trended online, he spent that night curled under a pile of flattened cardboard behind a row of dumpsters 3 blocks away from the scene. The bruising on his cheek had started to turn a sick purple. His fingers, still trembling, gripped a half-eaten sandwich someone had thrown his way. He had no idea he was the center of a digital revolution. I later found out from someone who volunteers nearby that Eli didn't even have a phone. No ID, no family, just silence, and a worn backpack filled with old clothes and a cracked photo of a young boy in a school uniform. He clutched it like it was sacred. When a journalist finally found him the next day, Eli didn't seem surprised, just tired, like life had hit him harder than any slap could. He didn't ask for money, didn't ask for revenge. When asked how he felt about what happened, all he said was, "That car was shinier than anything I'd touched in years. I didn't mean anything by it." And when the journalist told him his face was all over the internet, Eli just looked away. Why would anyone want to see me? But the world was already watching, and it wasn't just about a slap anymore. If Chapter 1 was the spark, and Chapter 2 was the wildfire, then Chapter 3 was the reckoning. The world had already passed judgment. By now, everyone knew his name, Raymond Vail, but the man himself had remained hidden. His security team kept him behind tall iron gates. No press conferences, no statements. Just silence, arrogance, and luxury as the outside world boiled over. But pressure has a way of cracking even the richest walls. 3 days after the video went viral, reporters finally got through. A drone caught aerial footage of Raymond on his tennis court, acting as though nothing had happened. When a CNN crew tried to question him as he exited his home in a Porsche, he paused only briefly to say, "I didn't do anything wrong. The situation's been grossly exaggerated. It was a minor reaction." Minor reaction. Those 2 words hit like gasoline on a fire. That same night, everything changed. Investigative journalists, now obsessed with the public villain of the hour, started digging into Raymond's past. What they found wasn't just one incident of cruelty. It was a pattern. There were whispers from former employees about toxic work environments, allegations of whistleblower retaliation. Secret lawsuits paid off quietly. A video resurfaced from years ago of Raymond yelling at a janitor during a corporate retreat, never released until now. A housekeeper anonymously told the press he once fired her for looking too sad in front of dinner guests. It wasn't just that Raymond had slapped a man. It was that he had built his empire on disdain for those beneath him. Meanwhile, the world wanted to know about the man on the other side of that slap, the one who had taken the blow without raising a voice. Who was Eli? That same journalist who'd found him behind the alley kept coming back. At first, Eli was quiet. He didn't want cameras. He didn't want sympathy. But eventually, as trust built, he began to speak. And when he did, people listened. Eli hadn't always been on the streets. He used to be a school teacher, 5th grade. He showed the reporter old lesson plans still folded in his backpack, handwritten quizzes, a reading list titled "Books That Make You Brave." But tragedy doesn't knock. It kicks the door in. Eli's wife was diagnosed with cancer. They drained their savings. He took loans, taught nights, worked weekends. Nothing was enough. The insurance company denied their claim. The hospital demanded payment before treatment. She died in a cold hospital room while he was arguing with a billing clerk. His home was foreclosed soon after. He lost custody of his daughter when he couldn't prove he had stable shelter. He'd never seen her again. People wept watching the interview. Not because Eli begged for pity, but because he didn't. He spoke softly, calmly, like a man who had made peace with being invisible to the world. I just wanted to see the car. It was beautiful. For a second, I forgot who I was. His story did something the slap alone couldn't do. It humanized the pain. Soon, people began calling him something new. The beggar who spoke with dignity. Hashtags shifted. No longer just about outrage. Now about inspiration. Artists painted his portrait. Poets wrote stanzas about him. And yet, Eli continued to sleep in a shelter, offering his food to others, deflecting the praise like it didn't belong to him. Back at Raymond's mansion, everything was unraveling. But the world had only just begun to respond. By the end of the week, the world wasn't just angry. It was mobilized. Petitions had gathered millions of signatures. Street murals of Eli appeared in cities he'd never stepped foot in. Protesters marched outside Vail Industries HQ, holding signs that read, "You can slap a man, but not silence a movement." Still, Eli kept quiet. Until the law stepped in. Legal advocacy groups, some with powerful names behind them, filed charges. Public prosecutors agreed to open a case, not just on the slap, but on possible human rights violations, class-based discrimination, and more. Social justice organizations offered Eli legal representation pro bono. But when they approached him, something unexpected happened. He accepted their help, not for vengeance, but for something else, something bigger. The courtroom was packed that day, not just with press and legal observers, but with everyday people. Construction workers, nurses, students, people in business suits sitting beside those in torn jackets. They weren't there for spectacle. They were there for Eli. He walked into that courtroom wearing a clean button-up shirt donated by a volunteer. He didn't have a polished look, but there was something dignified in the way he carried himself. Calm, quiet, unafraid. Raymond Vail was there too, seated beside his high-profile legal team, face unreadable. His suit probably cost more than Eli had seen in the last 10 years. Everyone expected fireworks, accusations, a tearful testimony. But what Eli delivered stunned the room into silence. When given a chance to speak, Eli stood, looked at the judge, then slowly turned to the gallery. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "I am not here today to see a man punished. I'm here to ask a question. How did we become a world where someone like me is stepped over, and someone like him is never told no? A world where pain is only seen when it's trending? I don't want revenge. I want change." People leaned in. You could hear sniffling. Even Raymond's lawyers looked at one another, caught off guard. "Don't jail the hand that struck me," Eli continued, turning briefly toward Raymond. "Educate the heart behind it. Because if we punish without understanding, then we just repeat the cycle." The judge didn't interrupt. No one did. Because what Eli gave wasn't just a speech. It was a mirror. And everyone felt a little smaller after looking into it. Raymond, for the first time since the scandal began, didn't look defiant. He looked different. Not broken. Not defeated. Just changed. His hands were clasped in front of him, and for the briefest second, he didn't look like a billionaire. He looked like a man who no longer knew where he stood in the world. The video of Eli's words was released that evening. It was viewed over 100 million times in 72 hours, translated into dozens of languages, quoted by world leaders, taught in classrooms, tattooed on arms. And somewhere in the silence that followed, the world stopped calling him the homeless man, or the victim. Now he was known by a different title, the beggar who taught us grace. Raymond Vale didn't fall overnight. It happened in layers, each more humiliating than the last, and unlike the flashy, curated ascent that built his billion-dollar name, his downfall was raw, messy, and painfully public. The courtroom speech by Eli had gone viral, not because it was loud, but because it was human. The world wasn't just condemning Raymond for a slap anymore. They were holding a mirror to every unchallenged act of entitlement, to every injustice people had been too afraid to speak about before. Raymond's name had once opened doors in every corner of industry and politics. Now, it was met with closed emails, severed contracts, and boarded-up partnerships. It started with the Vale Industries Board of Directors. A leaked memo revealed an emergency vote behind closed doors. It was brutal, unanimous. Raymond was stripped of his chairman position. Days later, he was removed entirely from the company bearing his last name. His portrait, which once hung in the executive lobby, was taken down in silence. Protesters began to gather outside every office building with the Vale logo etched into its glass. Signs read, "Greed wears expensive suits. We are all Eli. One slap, 1,000 stories." At first, Raymond tried to fight back. He went on a news program, clearly coached, clearly uncomfortable, and attempted an apology. It backfired spectacularly. His tone was hollow, his words robotic. He spoke more about his own suffering than the man he'd struck. Social media ripped it apart in minutes. Memes, hashtags, parodies. Sorry, not sorry. Raymond began trending by sundown. Then came the final blow, from someone no one expected. His own daughter, 17 years old, smart, quiet, often left out of the public spotlight. But this time, she spoke. Loudly. She published a handwritten open letter online. No PR spin, no handlers, just truth. To the world, I'm ashamed of what my father did. I was raised to respect every human being. I don't know the man in that video, but I don't want to be silent anymore. To Mr. Eli, I'm sorry. I'm truly, deeply sorry. It went viral within hours. The world didn't just hear her, they believed her. While Eli's face became a symbol of grace, Raymond's became a warning, a cautionary tale of what happens when unchecked ego meets a camera lens. Inside his mansion, once filled with guests, laughter, and parties, there was now only silence. His staff resigned. His calendar was empty. Former allies refused his calls. Even the home itself felt colder, sterile, as though the grandeur had turned on him. He stood at his 10-foot windows, watching the city from his perch in the sky. But this time, the city didn't look back. It moved on, toward Eli, toward justice, toward something that didn't have a price tag. And Raymond? For the first time in his life, he felt small, alone in a palace built by arrogance, haunted not by what he had lost, but by the man he had knocked to the ground, and the world that chose him instead. Fame was never something Eli asked for. He didn't have a PR team, a brand deal, or even a bank account. But somehow, through the pain and humility of his story, the world handed him a microphone. And this time, he didn't let go. After the trial, donations flooded in from every corner of the globe. Some gave $5, some gave thousands. One letter arrived with nothing but a crumpled dollar bill and the words, "You reminded me of my father. He never got a second chance. I want you to have yours." The total was staggering, but Eli didn't keep a cent for himself. Instead, he asked one question. How many people out there are invisible like I was? With the help of volunteers, local organizers, and legal aid groups, Eli launched something that hadn't existed before in the city. A community center with a kitchen, a shelter, and a listening ear. It was called the Dignity House. Eli didn't name it after himself. He named it after what he'd been denied for so long. The building was modest, a refurbished warehouse near the train station, but the warmth inside made it feel like home. They didn't just serve meals. They held job prep sessions, mental health circles, and offered warm clothes without questions or forms. And Eli? He wasn't a face on a poster. He was in the kitchen, washing dishes, serving plates, sitting beside people who had stories like his, and worse. He remembered every name, every detail, because he knew what it felt like to be looked at like you were less than nothing. Then came the invitations: universities, community halls, global NGOs, even the United Nations. At first, he said no. "I'm just a man who got slapped," he told one journalist. But people pushed him gently, reminding him that he wasn't just a symbol anymore. He was a movement, a voice for the voiceless. So he stood on stages in places he never dreamed of entering, not with polished speeches or expensive suits, but with raw truth. And then came one moment that silenced the world. A keynote event, full auditorium, bright lights, dozens of dignitaries and world leaders in suits and earpieces. Eli took the podium, glanced at the prepared speech the organizers handed him, then folded it away. He spoke from the heart. "My son's name was Jordan. He was 9. He loved trains and used to call my classroom his office. He had a cough one day. We took him in, but I couldn't pay the deposit. They said we had to wait. He died in a hallway while I begged someone, anyone, to treat him." The room fell completely still. You don't forget the sound of your own child dying in a place that's supposed to heal people. So, when I touched that car, when I saw that man's eyes fill with rage, I think part of me understood. He'd never heard a no, but I'd heard too many. That's why I'm not here to shame the rich. I'm here to ask, how much do you need before you can see someone like me as human? He stepped down to a standing ovation, but he didn't smile. Not for the applause, not even when world leaders reached out to shake his hand. Because he knew something they didn't. Kindness doesn't go viral. Consistency does. Eli returned home to Dignity House that evening. A group of kids waiting at the door ran up to hug him. A woman who used to sleep under a bridge gave him a scarf she knitted. One man whispered, "You saved my life." And for the first time in years, Eli allowed himself to cry. Not for what he lost, but for everything he had finally begun to rebuild. He had once been struck down. Now, the world stood beside him. Not just cheering, following. It was raining the day he walked in. Not a storm, not dramatic, just a slow, soaking rain that left footprints in the gravel path leading to the back door of Dignity House. No car, no umbrella, just a man in a thrift store jacket, a cap pulled low over his face, and hands that looked like they hadn't done real work in years. Nobody recognized him at first. He didn't want to be recognized. He gave a fake name, said he wanted to volunteer. Wasn't good with kids, he warned, didn't know how to cook, but he could sweep, clean toilets, wash dishes, anything, really. Eli glanced at him once, just once. He knew, but he didn't say a word. And so, Raymond Vale, the man whose name had once loomed from skyscrapers, became the silent man behind the kitchen sink. For weeks, he scrubbed pans, sorted crates, folded laundry. He avoided cameras. He kept his head down. He listened more than he spoke. And every time Eli passed through the room, Raymond would pause, just briefly, as if holding his breath. No one else knew who he was. They knew the slap. They'd seen the video. But this man? Just another quiet volunteer. A little too stiff, maybe. A little too clean-cut. But polite, efficient. Never once complained. One afternoon, after the last of the dinner crowd had eaten, Raymond stayed behind to mop the floors. The shelter was emptying out. Eli walked in, stood by the doorway, and said nothing for a while. Just watched. Then, in that low voice people had come to recognize the world over, Eli said, "You've been here long enough. I think it's time." Raymond turned. He looked smaller now, not in size, but in presence. Like everything he used to carry, pride, anger, power, had been left outside with the rain. He stepped forward. He didn't kneel, didn't give a speech, just looked Eli in the eyes and said, "I was wrong. No one had ever told me I was. Until you." He swallowed hard. "I didn't come here for forgiveness, but I'm asking anyway. Not because I deserve it. Because I finally understand what it means to reach out and not be slapped away." Eli nodded slowly. There was no applause, no audience. Just two men, once bound by a single cruel moment, now standing in the silence that followed it. Eli smiled faintly, just enough to soften the lines on his face. "You slapped me when I reached for help," he said. "Today, you reached back. That's enough for me." They shook hands. Nothing more was said. The next morning, a young volunteer snapped a photo without meaning to make history. She'd been taking pictures for a fundraiser page, capturing candid moments around the kitchen. Laughter, community, hope. One of the photos showed Eli plating meals with his sleeves rolled up. Beside him, hunched over a sink, sleeves soaked and hands deep in suds, was a man no one had seen there before. Raymond Vale. Someone recognized him. The photo leaked, and for the second time in 1 year, a video went viral. But this time, no one was being slapped. They were just washing dishes together. And the world watched again, but this time in silence.